Professor Uweng Tai, Director of Penang Institute, Encik Zairil Johari, CEO of Penang Institute, and Dr. Ahmad Farooq Musa, Islamic Renaissance Front. Ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam sejahtera. Good evening. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I'm very happy to be here in Penang and also to be speaking on this topic, which requires more discussion and more analysis. As Sheikh Zairil mentioned just now, he mentioned how in the old days there was this conflict between Kaum Muda and Kaum Tua, and he mentioned the great Egyptian reformer Muhammad Abdo. So he also mentioned Syed Sheikh Al-Hadi, who was actually from here, Penang. It is very true that unfortunately in Malaysia we tend not to support our scholars. We tend not to promote scholarship. And one example is that there are no institutes or foundations that are dedicated to the great reformists and scholars of the past. This is in contrast to some countries in the Middle East, which are much poorer countries than Malaysia, but they establish foundations and these foundations are supported by businessmen who are dedicated to ideas. And these foundations organize academic activities and other kinds of educational activities to promote the ideas of these great thinkers of the past. In fact, one of my specializations, I work on the Muslim thinker Abdul Rahman ibn Khaldun, and Ibn Khaldun died in 1406. In 2006, there were celebrations all around the Middle East commemorating 600 years of his death. It was commemorated by a series of conferences in Algeria, in Spain, in Morocco, in Istanbul. So 600 years, and people are still interested. Sheikh Al-Hadi is just less than 200 years, but more or less forgotten, in the sense that not many people are working on his writings or talking about the relevance of his ideas to reform today. Now, this is of course a very important topic, and it relates to the larger issue of our attitude, our understanding and our attitude towards reformism in the Muslim world, and in particular in Malaysia. Now, I'm not sure why, I was not sure until just now, why Dr. Ahmad Farooq asked me to speak on this particular topic. For a minute I was afraid, when he first asked me, I was afraid that he was asking me to make a case for Protestant Islam. Then I think somebody in the audience actually from Singapore said to me, it's unlikely that you would be making a case for Protestant Islam. Then I said, no, I'm not. And I checked the title, and the title is The Case of Protestant Islam. That doesn't imply that I'm making a case for. So I was relieved. But I was careful again because Sheikh Zairil was talking about the need for Protestant Islam. So I have to make some clarification that actually what I'm going to discuss is that there are some problems with the idea of Protestant Islam, because in some cases parallels that are not there have been drawn between Muslim reform and the Protestant Reformation. But that is not to say that there are no lessons that we cannot learn from the Protestant Reformation, right? So I wouldn't go so far as to say that we need to Protestantize Islam, and certainly Sheikh Zairil and many others who speak about the parallels are not calling for Islam to be Protestantized, but what we are talking about is looking for lessons and examples from history, and this can be from the history of other religions, including the history of Christianity and the history of Judaism, not to mention the history of Islam itself. So let me just proceed with my presentation. Please forgive me if I'm going to read on and off from my paper, and I'm doing that mainly because I want to finish within a reasonable amount of time, so that there will be some time left for discussion later. Now, Islam today has been made a problem because of the actions of a few people with an aberrant ideology, with the moral support or sympathy of a constituency of angry and disaffected Muslims in various parts of the world, often provoked by what they see as hypocritical policies and actions of the world's powers, in particular the United States, as well as their own governments. The problematic nature of Islam, however, was partly made possible by centuries of conflict between the Muslims and the West, between Islam, or rather between Muslims and the West. For the first few hundred years of its existence, Christianity, this I think is a very important point. For the first few hundred years of its existence, Christianity saw itself as the only world religion. As the only religion, in comparison to Judaism, to Hinduism, to Buddhism and so on, as the only religion which spread across the globe, across different civilizations, across different ethnic groups, across different linguistic groups. Now when Islam emerged, Islam was a challenge, a direct challenge to Christianity, because it competed in the same turf, as it were, competed for the same adherents. And like Christianity, Islam was it started out as a universal religion, and in that sense, if we define a world religion as religions that spread across ethnic groups, across linguistic borders and so on and so forth, we could say that it is really only Islam and Christianity that are world religions. So Christianity was very conscious of the fact that Islam was a competitor to its mission. And with the rise of Islam and its rapid spread beyond the Arabian Peninsula to Christian lands in Palestine, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula, it must have come as a shock to Christendom that there was now a religion that could challenge it. Now today, of course, the context of the global war on terror is not simply the presence of terrorists who act in the name of Islam, but also other religious extremists, such as those to be found among certain Christian groups in Malaysia as well, but also in the United States, such as the Christian Right, Christian Zionist groups, for example, as well as Jewish groups. Apart from that, there is also the problem of the global hegemonic power currently wielded by the United States. All these phenomena come together and create a certain context within which Muslim extremism and terrorism should be understood. One of the consequences of the global war on terror has been the highlighting or the heightening of suspicion towards Islam. The various revival orientations among Muslims and the social movements they have spawned. In other words, suspicion not just towards Islam but also towards the various movements that have emerged within Muslim society. The present, now my discussion, my idea, my objective is to provide a general framework for the understanding of the phenomenon of Muslim revival, which allows us to place in perspective the extremism and terrorism which are merely which are minority orientations among the wide variety of orientations that have been propounded by Muslims. Now, Muslim revival or resurgence, sometimes it is referred to as resurgence, reform, is not peculiar to the modern period. The idea of reform in Muslim societies dates back to pre-modern times. One of the most important revival movements actually began on the eve of the modern period. It began on the eve of the rise of the modern Saudi state. This is the Wahhabi movement. I will say more about Wahhabism later on. In a broad sense, we can define Muslim revival as a social and intellectual movement that seeks to correct what is perceived as wrong or lacking in the social, economic, political and cultural life of Muslims. Now let me just correct what I said. It's not a movement. It refers to a series of movements, various movements. When we say Muslim revival, or Muslim reform, or Muslim resurgence, we're referring to that collectivity of movements, various movements, that perceive that there's something wrong in the religious, in the political, in the social, in the economic, and the cultural life of Muslims. And the aim of revivalist thought and revivalist movements are to improve the economic, the social, and political life of Muslims by bringing them into closer alignment with what they understand to be the ideals of Islam. Now, Muslim revival is as much an endeavor to revive the spiritual essence of Islam among Muslims as it is to reconstruct and apply the ideals and the practices of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, to the present and to the future. Nevertheless, and this is where the problem is, despite such a collective desire among Muslims all over the world, there is no unified method or theory to realize these aims. And that's where the problem lies. Because you have a wide variety of perspectives on what Islam is, on what the ideals of Islam are, what are the central problems that are facing Muslim society today, and how Islam is to be applied to the solutions of our contemporary problems. And I'll say more about that little later on. But generally, this is the problem that we are facing. Now, as I said earlier on, the idea of reform is not new. It is not something that is peculiar to the modern period. In fact, the idea that there was something wrong in Muslim society was there even in the early days of Islam. Within the first few decades of Islam, there was already thinking that there's something wrong with Muslim society, and you had reform movements from the earliest of days. But today, in the modern period, reform takes on a slightly different meaning. Reform has to do with how the interpretation of the basic principles of Islam have to do with what extent Muslims can and should draw from modern ideas and practices in their economic, legal, political and cultural life. In other words, today, the challenge of Muslim reform is not merely to purify the religion, it is to deal with a very fundamental contradiction in modern life. Contradictions between the ideals of Islam on the one hand and the problems that modern life pose to us today. Let me just give you a few examples of problems posed by modern life. You have capitalism, which is a rather exploitative economic system, versus the ideal of the Islamic economy. In the minds of many Muslim reformers, there are certain ideals that have to be upheld in a genuinely Islamic economic system, and these are held to be at odds with the exploitative nature of capitalism. So how do you deal with that in a modern society, in a modern economy? When it comes to politics, you have democracy, but then you also have the idea of the Islamic State. Many people who speak of the Islamic State think of the functioning of the state in ideal terms in a way that's antithetical to the democracy. So again, you have a contradiction or a tension there. You have in modern life, you have the idea of freedom, but that comes up against the attempt to regulate cultural norms and even practices. Just one of the most recent examples that came up in Aceh, actually, I mean, very silly if you think about it, but it's very real problem. Women are being told that they are not allowed to ride pillion on a motorcycle. For some reason, it's supposed to arouse the men, who they're riding behind. But I don't get that, because presumably the woman riding the bike would be riding behind her husband, in which it should be okay, or she would be riding behind her brother, in which case, if there is any arousal, then there's something a bigger problem than they have. So, secondly, if a woman is to sit, the other way, I don't know what the term for that is, not pillion in other words, that would really pose a danger to her, right? Because it's not safe to ride a motorcycle sitting in that way. Anyway, so here you have, a very strange, I wouldn't say traditionalist view, but it is a view, about what is appropriate behavior for women, presumably founded on some notion of Islamic values, coming up against a modern notion of freedom. And then in the area of law, you've got secular versus Islamic law, with the obvious tensions. So the question is, how do Muslims deal with these challenges? Now, there have been a variety of opinions in the West and in the Muslim world regarding these fundamental tensions and these fundamental problems and the inability of Muslims to deal with these challenges. Now, two particular views stand out. According to one view, the problem does not lie in Islam itself, but in the ideology or in the orientation of certain Muslims. Extremists such as Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab from the 18th century, the founder of the Wahhabi orientation, or Sayyid Qutb in the 20th century, or Osama bin Laden in the 20th and 21st century, created mutant ideologies founded on hate and intolerance and the lack of compassion for fellow human beings. This orientation, sometimes called Islamism or political Islam, as it is often referred to, has to be marginalized by the majority of Muslims around the world who are peace-loving and moderate. This is one view. The problem is not Islam itself, but the ideology of certain Muslim groups. Now, the second view regards the problem as lying essentially within Islam itself. Islam is inherently irrational, much too politicized, too legalistic, unable to evolve and adapt to changing conditions. This is mainly because Islam did not undergo what Christianity did, a reformation. The Muslim world is partially stuck within its own Middle Ages and must reform its religion in order for it to live comfortably in the modern world. Now, the proponents of both views that I mentioned above, have forwarded the idea of the Protestantization of Islam, or what is sometimes called Islamic Protestantism. Now, there are two versions of Protestant Islam, each referring to two distinct phenomena. The first is the characterization of the existing Muslim revival movements as having Protestant-like features. Similarities and parallels are established between 16th century Protestant reformers and contemporary Muslim revivalists. Parallels between the two are observed at both the levels of institutions as well as at the level of theology. So in this first understanding, in this first view, the proponents of Protestant Islam are saying that there are similarities between what happened in Europe in the 16th century to Protestantism and what is happening to Muslim reform today. Now, in the second version is more prescriptive. The second version is saying that, well, since there are parallels between what happened in Europe to Protestantism and what is happening to Islam today, since there are such parallels, we should call for a Protestant-like Reformation in the Muslim world. Right? So this is the second version, which is prescriptive. It's not only saying that there are parallels between the two, but that we should we should call for a Protestant-like Reformation in the Muslim world. Now, in the literature that draws parallels between the Protestant Reformation and contemporary Muslim revival movements, the discussions generally revolve around questions of institutions and theology, as I said earlier on. The parallels drawn between contemporary Muslim revival movements and the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century tend to be sometimes superficial. The Protestant Reformation was the rejection of the obedience to the Roman papacy. It critiqued the beliefs and practices of the Catholic Church and society. For example, Luther was critical of the sale of indulgences and many other practices of the Catholic Church. In the case of Islam, however, there was no church to break away from. There was no central institution similar to the Catholic Church and Christianity that could be the object of reform to begin with. Rather, what Muslim revivalists sought to reform was certain Muslim beliefs and practices and not Islam itself. The distinction between Islam as deen on the one hand and the beliefs and practices of Muslims on the other has always been clear to Muslim revivalists. For example, Muslim revivalists did not advance any new theory of salvation, unlike the case of Protestantism. Furthermore, many of the changes that the Protestant Reformation sought to bring about were already found in Islam to begin with. For example, the idea that Islam is both personal and experiential and therefore allows for the empowerment of the believer is nothing specific to contemporary Muslim revival movements and can be said to be a cornerstone of traditional understandings of Islam. Yet, in spite of the idea, in spite of this, that the parallels are often superficial, Muslim scholars and activists such as Abdul Karim Suruj, Tariq Ramadan, Hashim Abajari have been referred to as looters of Islam, as if they had proposed changes that parallel those of the Protestant Reformation. But as I said, one can make the argument that the changes proposed by the Protestant Reformation, or the changes that came about through the Protestant Reformation, changes to Christianity, were already there, present in Islam. And in fact, it's quite interesting that one of the earliest, probably the first Latin translation of the Quran, the preface or the introduction to that Latin translation was written by Luther himself. In fact, I think there are very few copies of this manuscript available. One of them is in Malaysia, in the library of ISTA in Kuala Lumpur. So what this implies is that Luther, of course, was very familiar with Islam, and one might, in this case, speak of the Islamization of Christianity rather than the Protestantization of Islam. Now, what the idea that there are parallels between the Protestant Reformation and contemporary Muslim revival movements, as I said, had led to calls for Islamic Protestantism. Such calls sometimes are oblivious to the fact that works that establish the parallels between the two generally refer specifically to extremist movements, as far as Muslims are concerned, as far as the Muslim side is concerned. You see, the parallels that are drawn are between specific Protestant movements in the 16th century and extremist Muslim movements like the Wahhabis or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Right? So that alone, should lead us to be cautious about advocating for Protestant Islam unless we qualify what we mean by that. Now, what many of the discussions on this phenomenon gloss over is the fact that those who have been calling for Islamic Protestantism or the Protestantization of Islam were not suggesting that Islamic theology should be reformed. They were more concerned with social and jurisprudential reforms, They were not calling for the kinds of changes that Christianity underwent during the 16th and 17th centuries. Furthermore, a case can be made for the idea that Islam, as I already mentioned earlier, already had those characteristics attributed to Reformed Christianity. There is no equivalent of the papacy in Islam, not even in Shia Islam. Whatever is said of the spiritual autonomy of the individual in terms of his or her relationship with God is as true of Sunni as it is of Shia Islam. Finally, it should also be said that the reference to certain Muslim scholars and activists as the Luther of Islam can be said to be inappropriate. Martin Luther is probably not an appropriate model for Muslim revivalists for a number of reasons. For one, he was anti-Jewish. He referred to Jews as a miserable and accursed people, and I'm quoting, a miserable, blind and senseless people. He advised Christians to be on their guard as the synagogues of the Jews house, he advised Christians to be on their guard as the synagogues of the Jews house nothing but devils practicing conceit, lies, blasphemy and defaming God. For this reason alone, I think it is very problematic for Muslims to take Luther as a model. And of course, in Islam itself, in the Muslim world itself, we do have scholars who are also anti-Jewish, particularly in the modern period after the emergence of the state of Israel. Now, this is not to say that there are no parallels and no lessons for us to learn from the Protestant Reformation. Right? And I would like to make a few points about that.